Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The Small Business Administration acted in record time to suspend ATI Government Solutions from federal contracting. SBA made the decision the day after a video emerged from the O'Keefe Media Group, a right-wing activist organization, showing that an official from ATI admitted to defrauding the SBA's 8A program. For more on the broader implications of the ATI suspension, Federal News Network executive editor Jason Miller joins us now to discuss. Hey, Jason.
Jared.
So what was the reason for this suspension in the first place? And tell us a little bit more about this company.
Absolutely. Now, basically what happened was a senior program manager from ATI Government Solutions met with James O'Keefe. Now, James O'Keefe was in disguise. So this is kind of something he's known for doing. He's a conservative activist who we've seen before has engaged in deception to conduct his investigations. And then in the video, he basically got this ATI executive or senior government manager to admit that they are a pass-through and many times to larger firms. Now, what this ATI employee said was the company routinely does what they say less than 50% of the work required under typical 8A contracts. Now, there are rules and exceptions, but the rules generally say that you have to do at least 50% of the work on an 8A contract beyond giving that to your partners. This is to avoid this idea of pass-through. Now, ATI Government Solutions is owned by the Susanville Indian Ranchera tribe. They've been in the 8A program since February of 2019. And I did a quick look at the usaspending.gov website. And in 2025, ATI had 32 active government contracts worth more than $144 million. The Treasury Department was their largest customer.
And so how unusual was it for that suspension to happen as quickly as it did?
It was highly unusual, according to the experts I spoke to. Now, under the suspension, SBA issued it government-wide, so ATI cannot receive any new contracts or any follow-on task or delivery orders. They can continue to work on existing contracts that are funded. Now, in addition to the company, SBA also suspended 3 ATI executives. Their founder and CEO, Firmenich Crutchfield, Scott Deutschman, the co-founder and corporate development officer, and Marina Molavenia, who's ATI's CFO. Now, since SBA's suspension, GSA, Treasury have also suspended ATI. Now, what's interesting is SBA's suspension is government-wide, so really what Treasury and GSA are doing is really just piling on the pressure by announcing that they, too, have added to that suspension. Now, SBA made the decision to suspend ATI and its leadership unusually quickly. I talked with Sam Lee, a former director of policy and planning and liaison at SBA, and now the managing partner of Sam Lee Law and the author of GovCon Intelligence. He says typically agencies go through a much more detailed process before making a decision to suspend a company or a person.
Ordinarily, in suspension debarment, an agency would go through a fact-finding process. They may issue a show cause letter to the company to get the company's side. The reason for that is suspension is a very serious penalty and consequence. That company is now prohibited from getting new government contracts, and in most situations, it can't receive options or orders. In most subcontracts, it can't get a subcontract either. So suspending them is preventing them from getting most types of government awards. SBA did this, looks like, within a 24-hour period, most likely without getting input from the firm.
Lee says ATI now has 30 days from the time of suspension to come back to SBA with the reasons why it shouldn't be suspended. He says he would have expected the firm to have responded fairly quickly with their side of the story and explain why whatever was said in the video is not necessarily meriting the suspension of this type. Now, I reached out to ATI several times, including their law firm, but didn't hear back. And the Susanville Indian Ranchera Tribal Chairman, Arian Hart, did post a statement on Facebook, and it reads, "The Susanville Indian Ranchera, a federally recognized Indian tribe, is aware of the inquiry by the SBA regarding the tribe's participation in SBA's 8A program. They are committed to fully cooperating with SBA and providing any and all information necessary to enable a thorough review. The tribe has also launched an internal investigation to ascertain all relevant facts and determine the best course of action for the tribe." He goes on to say integrity, accountability, compliance are foundational to their tribal government and their business operations, and take this, obviously, allegations very seriously.
And so just to zoom out a little bit, Jason, SBA has been conducting this broader review of the 8A program for quite a few months now. What does that review tell us? And does this ATI situation play into it in any way that we can tell?
It's hard to say right off the bat whether or not how this ATI government solutions situation plays into it, but we know SBA did kick off the internal review of the 8A program back in July after news broke of a bribery scandal through the 8A program at USAID. Now, what we know so far is the audit is being led by SBA's Office of General Contracting and Business Development. They're collaborating, obviously, with other agencies. Remember, this is the office that's also responsible for certifying 8A companies and reviewing agency 8A contracts. So it's interesting to see who's leading this effort. SBA says the scope of the review will focus on high dollar and limited competition contracts that have been awarded over the last 15 years, so going back to 2010. I also spoke with Nicole Potroff, an equity partner with the law firm Coprince, McCall & Potroff, and they work with a lot of 8A and other small firms. She says there are several reasons why there are problems with 8A contracts. Sometimes she says it's on the government side, not including certain provisions. Sometimes it is true fraud by companies, but really more times than not, what the problem is, 8A companies struggle to understand the rules of the program.
I'm not surprised that there are investigations going on. And here, I don't know, I didn't review the contract or anything. I don't know whether it included everything it was supposed to, but that's really a really important question when the government is investigating these types of companies, any kind of 8A companies that have gotten 8A work, is that factor of False Claims Act versus simple mistake. So this happens quite a bit too. I hear from clients a lot that very genuinely, innocently thought they were complying with the limitation on subcontracting for 8As, which it obviously just cites straight to the regular limitation on subcontracting and says it's the same. But plenty of clients think, oh, well, I can exclude this amount of money, or, they're a similarly situated entity, and they just don't understand those things. So they think maybe because another company is small that they're similarly situated, and we have to explain, no, they have to be 8A. So those types of things happen fairly often. That is, to me, pretty innocent mistake, and the type of thing where our advice to clients is typically like, let's definitely be upfront about it. Let's tell SBA, let's tell the agency, but let's also immediately work toward compliance and make the changes we need to make. Those are not typically things that rise to the level of these very scary federal investigations where DOJ gets involved.
Now, I've also talked to Lee, and he says while he hasn't heard from companies or getting auditing letters from SBA or other agencies, it's clear from the video that SBA are really looking at what they call the limitations of subcontracting rule. You heard Potroff talk a little bit about this, but that's commonly referred to the 50% rule. And there's a lot of kind of concern about whether or not companies are being passed through to larger businesses or not. So I think, Jared, generally speaking, I think we know some of the places where the investigation is heading.
And so once again, to look at the bigger picture of this program, should other contractors who are already in the 8A program or might want to be, should they be worried about the future of the program?
So Lee and Potroff both says it depends. The typical lawyer response, right? Now, on one hand, the Trump administration is sending clear signals through the accusations of widespread fraud and other actions that 8A and more broadly small disadvantaged businesses are less of a priority for them. In fact, the Trump administration lowered the government-wide goal to 5% from 15% for STBs soon after they took office. Now, Lee says companies in the 8A program today may be getting a little bit of whiplash.
The number of awards being made in the 8A program has dropped precipitously. The number of companies getting into the 8A program also has dropped. In the last year, it was over 550 companies that were approved for the 8A program. And as of August in 2025, there are only 66 companies that have been approved for the 8A program. So it's getting much harder to get in. And then once you get in, the number of awards is less, and you have this additional threat of an audit.
Now, of course, Jared, this all comes after the agency set records in the number of contracts and the amount of dollars going to 8A firms in 2024. 13% of all eligible prime contracts went to 8A firms in 2024, worth almost $42 billion. So obviously a lot of money, a lot of interest, but then again, a lot of scrutiny is coming down on that program.
All right, Federal News Network's Jason Miller, thanks very much.
Always a pleasure.
And you can find Jason's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. From program design to policy evaluation, social scientists offer methods and insights that could strengthen federal decision-making. But institutional barriers and cultural divides still keep many of them on the sidelines. For more on what government is missing and how to fix it, Terry talked with Alexander Hertel-Fernandez, the Herbert H. Lehman Professor of Government at Columbia University.
Social scientists, and I count myself in this category, collect data to systematically test and develop theories about how the world works. And social scientists can include economists who study labor markets, financial markets. It can include sociologists who study inequality, how inequality is produced and reproduced in families and society. It can include political scientists like myself who think about the intersection of markets and government. And it can include anthropologists who are trying to understand family and societal structures as well. But the through line is really collecting data in a systematic way to develop insights about how the world works.
So you yourself, as you said, are a social scientist. You've worked in both the academic and the policy spaces. What do social scientists bring to the policy table that other experts might not?
Yeah, another great question. I think social science has long been an important tool for policymakers in a couple different ways. Social scientists can collect data to help policymakers better understand problems in the world that they might want to address. For instance, particular groups in society that might be disadvantaged because of high rates of poverty or low access to economic mobility. Similarly, social scientists can think about ways to address those problems. And there's a long tradition of social scientists thinking about policy interventions and then testing them to improve social and economic well-being. And social scientists can help better understand the world through particular lenses. They can come up with concepts or theories that help make sense of what's happening. And all of those are ways in which social scientists can help policymakers when they're designing policies and when they're implementing policies. And I had the privilege of seeing this firsthand when I served at the Department of Labor in the Office of Management and Budget. I think there was a lot of great work from social scientists that helped to inform those agencies. And there's a lot more that could be done, especially as we look to the potential rebuilding that, in my opinion, needs to happen after this current administration.
You mentioned early on that social scientists collect data. Sometimes we think of social science as a more qualitative assessment or recommendations. How would you articulate that social science blends the qualitative and the quantitative?
In the social science tradition, you have some economists who think about much more quantitative measures, for instance, like the unemployment rate, for instance, is a quantitative number that we count every month. But there are also a vibrant tradition of qualitative data as well. You can think about, for instance, how social scientists like sociologists or anthropologists or political scientists might study people's experiences with government. And when I think back to my time serving in the last administration, we drew very heavily on qualitative work that described people's burdens and barriers to accessing government services and programs, like the stigma that they might feel when they show up to apply for food assistance, or the kind of stress they might experience when they're compiling the necessary documentation to apply for unemployment insurance benefits. Those are really important things for policymakers to know, but often aren't as easily quantifiable as, say, a specific number like the unemployment rate.
That's really helpful. Just to test another theory, some critics say social science leans left, but there are conservative positions in social science too. How do the approaches differ, and why does that diversity of thought matter?
Yeah, I want to highlight what you ended on, which is the importance of diversity of thought. Now, that might be ideological or partisan, but many times it's not. And I think what makes social science and academic research within social science so valuable is that you have competing perspectives, and each side comes with their own data and interpretation of the world, and you see what fits the data better. And I think it's that kind of robust debate that really advances the field. Like I said, it's not always going to line up on ideological or partisan lines, but I do think it's important that there's a diversity of perspectives in the social scientists, people who might focus on one institution versus another, or one type of market versus the other.
I'm speaking with Alexander Hertel-Fernandez. He's the Herbert H. Lehman Professor of Government at Columbia University. So give us some examples about how social science has improved government programs regardless of which party was in power.
Yeah, there's a really rich tradition of the federal government relying on social science dating back to the New Deal, trying to understand during the New Deal, for instance, the depth of the Great Recession and possible responses by the federal government. More recently, to give a couple examples that I was involved with or saw during my time in the federal government at the Department of Labor, we relied on social science to better understand how unemployment insurance was and was not working during the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, trying to understand what groups of workers were having trouble accessing unemployment benefits and why. So, for instance, for some groups of people, it was that they didn't know that they were eligible and they were failing to apply. For others, they knew that they were eligible, but they were encountering long delays in trying to access benefits from their state UI agencies. And having that kind of picture from academic research that we commissioned at the Department of Labor really helped us think about the different interventions that we might want to make.
Sounds like it could be especially productive in program design and thinking through the experience of the intended beneficiary.
Exactly. And it's also relevant for program implementation, too, to better understand once a policy has not been running, how well it's reaching the different populations that it's intending to reach.
You've suggested some particular ways where social scientists could be more intentionally engaged in government operations. Talk us through those.
I've been thinking about this ever since leaving the administration, the last administration in 2023. But I think this question of how the federal government can better build on social science and social scientists has become all the more pressing, given the really radical retrenchment we've seen of many agencies and core functions of the federal government in recent months under the current presidential administration. All told, we've seen tens of thousands of federal workers either fired or pushed out, deciding to retire, and that's a loss of real capacity. As I got to see and learn firsthand, many of these civil servants have spent their careers understanding deeply how government programs work and do not work and how to affect change within the federal government. And losing that expertise is a real crisis. I think as we try to think about an eventual rebuilding of the federal government, social scientists have an important role to play to work with former federal civil servants to try and capture that knowledge that we're losing. When I think back to, for instance, my time at the Department of Labor, I remember folks who had been there for decades who knew intimately how programs like the registered apprenticeship programs that the Department of Labor administers or unemployment insurance, how these programs work. And losing those kinds of staff really makes it hard to think about administering those programs effectively. So right now, folks who are listening, who are social scientists based at think tanks or universities, have a role to play in trying to capture that knowledge by collaborating, for instance, with civil servants who have left government to be able to collect their experiences and reflect on how we might reform and rebuild in the future. But it's not just about the current moment. It's also thinking about what comes next after, say, this presidential administration. As I mentioned, there have been so many agencies and programs that have either been entirely shuttered or devastated by retirements and firings. And to rebuild, I think we can draw from the expertise of social scientists working together with former civil servants to design new ways that the federal government can work and potentially even pull in some of those folks and those social scientists into the rebuilding process. There are already laws on the books like the Intergovernmental Personnel Act that permit academics to spend short periods of time in government agencies. And if Congress were to amend that law, they could make it even easier. Right now, it's just faculty members from universities who can spend time on government service leave under that law. But you could imagine amending it to allow graduate students or postdoctoral fellows to be able to help build the capacity and expertise in government. Similarly, over the longer term, you could imagine new structures that would be able to pull in academics into specific projects within agencies. This is something that some agencies already do, regularly recruiting academics to spend time working at, say, the Department of Labor or the Department of Health and Human Services. But you could imagine doing this much more at scale if Congress were, for instance, to create a new agency with funding that could provide fellowships to allow agencies to find academics that could support their work. You could imagine doing this in a way that recruited broadly all across the country and could really create a pipeline of folks from academia serving in government. And I think that has the potential to benefit both government by bringing in folks with specialized expertise to be able to come in and serve in government agencies. And it also helps academics. Speaking for myself, I find that my research and teaching has been profoundly changed by having the experience to have worked in government. I feel that I'm able to communicate to students much better what it takes to be a potential civil servant or someone who's trying to work within the federal government. And it's also changed my research. It's indicated places that more research could be helpful to unlock new policy. And I suspect that is likely to be true for many other academics.
So you described there some programmatic solutions, some structural solutions. I just want to ask you about culture change. Do you feel like on the government side, it is an open and receptive environment? And do you feel like on the academic side, it's viewed as a career enhancement?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is it varies a little bit by field. I think there are some fields, say within academia, where it's much more common for academics to take time off and work in government. I think economics, for instance, and law have done a much better job of nurturing that kind of culture. And it's been helped on the government side through organizations within government like the Council of Economic Advisors or the offices of chief economists. Now, many of the large CFO Act agencies have offices of chief economists that tend to recruit academic economists and graduate students to work in those agencies. So that creates a pipeline. It creates a culture where this is more common. For some of these other disciplines, though, like sociology, anthropology, political science, I think academics have just as much to offer as economists. And so it'd be worth thinking through, how do you create the structures within government that could pull those kinds of researchers in? And then also, how do you create the incentives and culture within academia to say, this is a worthwhile thing to do? I'm not certainly saying by any stretch of the imagination that this is something every academic has to do, but I do think that we should create the opportunity for folks who have the skills and interests to be able to work in government to do so.
Alexander Hertel Fernandez is the Herbert H. Lehman Professor of Government at Columbia University. We'll post this interview and a link to his article at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. The Trump administration's sweeping cuts to federal grants are triggering a wave of legal challenges, especially from nonprofits and research institutions. And more cases are landing in the Court of Federal Claims. Here to explain why and what funding recipients need to know before they sue is partner at Jenner & Block, David Robbins. He talked with Terry Gerton.
This administration has sort of turned the world of grants on its head. It's been very disruptive. What is the big news now, 8 months in?
Well, I agree with you. It's been very disruptive. And the big news now is that the courts are weighing in, including the Supreme Court, forcing grant recipients who want to recover for money they're otherwise owed into a specialized court called the Court of Federal Claims.
This is a new process for grantees, right? They've had other paths that they've followed in the past.
They have had other paths. They could have used normal district court, Article 3 courts to enjoin a termination or wrongful action and get their grant restarted. This is different. You have to sue for monetary damages. For recoveries, you let the grant get terminated and then sue in the Court of Federal Claims to recover what you can.
This seems like a real change in both judicial philosophy and administrative processing. What's driving that change?
I'm not entirely sure what's driving the change. I focus more on the effects. The effects really are you have to give up on restarting the grant, which is a truly unfortunate development for a lot of the tremendous organizations out there doing great things, or what they used to be doing, great things, with federal grant dollars.
And so what kind of cases fall into this new process?
Anyone seeking to recover from the fund freeze, if you recall, the administration just stopped paying any money on grants for a while. And many didn't restart. That's blatantly unlawful, and it's a breach of the grant itself. They're entitled to recover for that money, and they're entitled to recover for termination costs, things like that, driving a lot of this need to recover and need for redress. But that's funneled to the Court of Federal Claims now.
But they used to begin to process these through district court. Is that correct?
They could have processed through district court. There was a choice. If you wanted to bring a sort of breach of contract claim, because a grant at its core is a contract, we agree to do certain things, the federal government agrees to give us certain money. That could theoretically have gone to the Court of Federal Claims, but that takes a while. So you could go to normal district court and try and restart things much faster.
Well, now that everybody's being pushed into the Court of Federal Claims, what does that mean in terms of reasonable amount of time for resolution?
There's still just one bit of nuance. There's an ability to go to district court, but you're going to face a motion to dismiss. You're going to face uncertain judicial precedent. Do you actually get to recover? That's probably a lot of lost time and a lot of lost money. The Court of Federal Claims is a longer process. It's a multi-year process, generally, before you finally recover. It's much longer.
So does this have the effect of dissuading even applying for grants if you know that this is going to be a very complicated and expensive resolution process should your grant be terminated?
I'm not sure the termination rules and where to sue will dissuade people from applying, but the risks of not seeing the money at all, the actual fear of real terminations, which have been happening in great numbers, is probably going to dissuade organizations from applying.
And so how can organizations, especially grantees, grant recipients, prepare for this on the front end of a grant application?
I think the important part for grant applicants is to watch their spending. Don't get ahead of themselves. Make sure they're spending in line with actual receipts from the government. The challenge is, let's say they take on a lease that's overly long because they're expecting the full course of their government grant to play out. I'm not sure that's a reasonable assumption, at least in these times. So the best preparation is a little bit smarter fiscal management.
I'm speaking with David Robbins. He's a partner at Jenner and Block. So we're in an odd period of time right now. We've just finished a fiscal year. We're in a lapse of funding, at least for a while. How should grantees be thinking about future opportunities?
It's still worth looking out on grants.gov or the normal funding sources for new opportunities, because if they can get government money and that's important to their organization, it's worth doing. But I would view it less as a lifeline and more of opportunities that arise once in a while.
And how is this administration defending this new approach to grants and its terminations? Are those holding up in court?
We haven't seen challenges in the Court of Federal Claims yet. We have seen some courts giving injunctions, Article III normal district courts giving injunctions, but then the appellate courts are saying there's no jurisdiction here. Go talk to the Court of Federal Claims. So I don't know if it's holding up in court, and that's part of the problem. That's why we have such uncertainty. And the practical reality is challenges probably have to go to the Court of Federal Claims, at least until certainty prevails.
And the way this is playing out, if you're a grantee, if your grant was terminated, you used to be able, if you filed a case, right, the grant payment or process would continue until the case was resolved. That doesn't seem to be playing out here now.
There was an ability in normal district court to get an injunction stopping the government from terminating, basically forcing them to pay until the case resolves. You're right. That's not happening anymore because the Court of Federal Claims can't enjoin the government. It's not that kind of court. They can only award monetary damages at the end of a sometimes lengthy process.
So now if you're terminated, you're just terminated, and the best you can do is sort of fight for the leftovers.
It's still worth looking at whether it's worth trying in district court. I just view the odds as pretty long, so I think your statement is right.
So what does this mean longer term for the future of federal grant making? Does this chill the process? Does it chill the application process? What do you think the atmosphere will be going forward?
I think in the near term it will suppress the process. I think there will be fewer applicants. I think there will be fewer awards. Social policy is being engineered through government funds, of course. But this is administration by administration. New administrations can have new priorities. So I'm not sure what the medium or long term holds, but for the short term, it will have a chilling effect.
And is the Court of Federal Claims prepared for this onslaught of cases?
The Court of Federal Claims has a full load of judges for the first time in a while, which is great. But no, they're still busy just like every other court. And at this stage of my career, I've got a lot of friends who are judges. I am projecting that they are a little bit worried about what might be a bow wave of potential inbound cases that they will have to decide.
So if you are a federal grant maker, a program manager, for example, what do you need to know about this change in process?
For federal grant makers, I think they need to know the same things as grant recipients. These grants may not last all the way through. Grants may require heightened approval within agencies, so the process may slow down. It may just be harder to get these grants out the door.
David Robbins is a partner at Jenner and Block, and we'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. This year, there's been a lot of focus on streamlining the federal acquisition regulation as the Trump administration moves through its big FAR overhaul project. But increasingly, the burdens of an overcomplicated acquisition system aren't just an issue for traditional government contractors. It's becoming a bigger and bigger topic for academic institutions, too. To dig into that topic, I talked with Aaron Breesley. He's the head of the Government Contract Practice Group at the law firm Bradley, Arent, Bolt, Cummings, LLP.
First of all, federal funding for R&D or research and development at colleges and universities has been steadily increasing over the past decade or so. So agencies such as the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, National Science Foundation, NIH, etc., all rely on universities and colleges to carry out vital research. And so, in many cases these days, the line between what is considered a grant or a contract, that activity is becoming blurred with increasing frequency. And so universities are now performing work that falls squarely under the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR, which is the regulatory framework that governs traditional government contracts. And universities are also finding themselves being subject to agency specific supplements to the FAR, such as, for example, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. Now, at the same time, universities are also generally subject to what's called the uniform guidance, and that pertains to grants at universities. And so universities for a long time have been familiar with and used to complying with what is now codified and referred to as the uniform guidance for grants, but they're also having to comply with additional rules and regulations under the FAR, et cetera, that they haven't had to comply with before. So not only are you getting increased federal funding, you're getting increased university participation in grants and federal contracts. And so universities and colleges are now being subject to more rules and regulations. At the same time, you're getting increased scrutiny from federal agencies, inspector generals, and the Department of Justice. And so this has really created the perfect storm for colleges and universities, whereby both compliance burdens and compliance risks are at an all-time high.
And can you give us an example of some of those risks? In what ways are agencies stepping up their enforcement? And in cases where agencies have stepped ahead with enforcement actions, what have been some of the negative consequences for colleges and universities on the wrong side of that?
Yeah, great question. So a recent example is Georgia Tech University. Georgia Tech settled a False Claims Act case that was brought by the government. They did not admit any wrongdoing, but nonetheless, they settled the case. That's obviously a huge administrative headache, a lot of time, a lot of money, and then there's a reputational component that comes along with it. That case had to do with cybersecurity and data protections. So that's another thing that historically universities have not had to comply with to the same extent as, say, your traditional defense contractor. And so universities now are really having to comply more and more with increasingly complicated cybersecurity rules and requirements. And when they don't comply, they run the risk of all sorts of adverse and negative consequences, including but not limited to allegations that the university violated the False Claims Act. And again, a recent example of that is the Georgia Tech case.
The piece of this with more FAR-based procurements going to colleges and universities is super interesting to me. And, a lot of government contractors in our audience, so there's a lot of folks out there that are going to be saying, yeah, I feel your pain here. But do you have any sense of what's behind that kind of shift from the grant space to the contract space in education? And the second part of that question really is, what do colleges need to do there? Do they need to start building their own certified cost accounting systems in the way a big government contractor would?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's a couple or a few things. One, there's a lot of money in federal contracting, and colleges and universities are seeing this. And so you're seeing them more and more go after traditional federal contracts. So an example of this is, like a university going after a data collection contract, solicitation that was issued by the Department of State. And universities are going after those, and then they're finding themselves in the arena with traditional federal contractors. So the example that I mentioned about a Department of State data collection and management contract. The University of Maryland, for example, bid on that, did not end up getting that contract, and then ended up filing a bid protest at the Government Accountability Office. And so colleges and universities historically are not used to participating in those types of arenas, the bid protest arena, having to deal with FAR-based contracts, FAR-based compliance systems, et cetera. And so they're having to get up to speed quickly as they are becoming more involved in these spaces. And obviously, the more compliance obligations you have, the more compliance risk there is. With respect to your second question about what colleges and universities can be doing or should be doing, it depends. Not all colleges and universities are the same. Some are small, some are big, some are more heavily reliant on research and research funding. But a common thing that we generally recommend is to have a centralized compliance framework. So rather than a fragmented framework, say, that is implemented on a department by department basis or some other similar basis, it's important to have a top-down centralized compliance framework that involves all requisite stakeholders. So Office of General Counsel, outside counsel, research administration, procurement team, internal auditors, etc. So you want the left hand talking to the right hand. You want a universal and centralized compliance framework so that there's no uncertainty at the university in terms of who needs to be doing what and what the expectations are and what the rules are.
But I imagine within that centralized compliance hub, you would still want a cadre of grant specialists and contract specialists, since the worlds are pretty different. Is that kind of a best practice, or how have you seen people do it?
Yeah, that's right. And again, it really depends on how heavily involved in traditional federal contracting a university is going to be. Grant specialists, yes, most universities have a lot of those, at least large research institutions. But with respect to universities that are gradually becoming more involved in the traditional government contract space, so with FAR-based contracts, I don't know of a specific university that has one specific person whose sole job is devoted to overseeing, administering, and tracking compliance. As things progress, if universities get into those spaces more and more, it's quite possible that those types of positions will start to exist. But what we mostly see is universities relying on outside consultants, their existing compliance personnel, existing in-house attorneys, and then, of course, outside counsel.
And I guess one last thing we should clarify here, just because, you know, the changing role of the government getting involved in higher education under this particular administration has been in the news a lot lately. Just want to make sure folks understand, is that the sort of thing we're talking about here, or the things that we're describing here longer-term trends that span beyond one administration?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So far, the things I've been talking about have really been administration agnostic. There are, as I'm sure folks have seen in the news, this administration and the DOJ has discussed apparently using the False Claims Act and other similar tools to try to police university compliance with the administration's diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. That's something that is definitely worth keeping an eye on if you're a college or a university, and that obviously has a lot of university general counsels losing sleep at night. But what I'm referring to really is much more, like I said, apolitical and administration agnostic. It has to do with mostly research, development, things like that goes on under any administration.
But the same basic tools for enforcement are there kind of no matter what the issue is, right? Because I can remember a time when people were surprised that the False Claims Act could be used for example, the Georgia Tech cyber issue that you mentioned. You could see False Claims Act cases being brought on, almost any sort of policy or ideological basis, I guess.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And so the same type of repercussions or consequences that have always been there are still there. There's just an increased risk of being subject to those consequences. So among the consequences are, at one end of the extremes, False Claims Act liability or suspension or debarment from federal programs where you can no longer get federal contracts or federal funding. At the other end, it's things like adverse audit findings, investigations with conclusions that recommend remedial actions that colleges or universities take in order to shore up their processes and procedures and things like that. The only other thing that I might add where we're seeing increased activity from colleges and universities and in turn an increased compliance risk is in the other transaction authority space. The government is relying increasingly on other transaction authority to get its need met because of the flexibility associated with OTAs. And we're seeing prestigious research institutions like University of Colorado, Johns Hopkins, Georgia Tech, and others who are now participating in OTA agreements and consortia. And those arrangements are not necessarily subject to the FAR, but the government can choose to incorporate FAR provisions into those agreements, which in turn subjects colleges and universities to FAR rules and requirements. And so that's another way that colleges and universities are getting more involved with federal funding and where compliance risk and enforcement risk is really increasing at the same time.
Aaron Beasley is the head of the Government Contracts Practice Group at the law firm Bradley Arendt Bolt Cummings, LLP. And you can find this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hundreds of thousands of federal employees are showing up to work and not getting paid on time during the second longest government shutdown. State Department employees who process passports are among those working without pay. That's an unusual step because that part of the agency is fee-funded, and it can normally pay staff on time during a lapse in congressional funds. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman has been covering this issue, and he joins us now with more. Hey, Jory.
Hey, Jared.
So how many employees at the State Department are we actually talking about here who are working without those paychecks?
So it's actually a majority of the State Department's workforce. About 62% of its workforce, according to its updated contingency plans, are accepted, meaning that they are working without pay during the government shutdown, but they typically receive back pay once the shutdown ends. That's how every other shutdown has worked up until this point. But we are talking about passport services employees here. They are in an unusual situation because they are funded through passport and visa fees, and they have always gotten paid regardless of whether the government's shut down or not. And for perspective on this, I spoke to Boyd Hinton. He's the president of the National Federation of Federal Employees, Local 1998. He represents about 1,500 passport services employees, and he told me that this has never really been up for debate, that even the only other time this even was a question was during the longest government shutdown, the 35-day shutdown under the first Trump administration. And even then, he says, passport services employees in the end were paid on time.
We had the paycheck coming. We had it coming. And it was all like, oh, we're fee-based, we're fee-based, we're fee-based. You ain't going to get impacted. You ain't going to get impacted. But this time around, we are impacted because our first check was curtailed, and then now this check coming in, straight up zero.
And that's Boyd Hinton. He's the president of NEFI Local 1998.
Okay, so what is different this time, Jory? I mean, why are these fees not being used this time to pay that staff?
Right now, not a lot of good answers. The State Department didn't provide an answer to my questions about where the money is and why it's not being used to pay passport services employees on time. Hinton says that he's not getting a lot of answers on the ground either. He works at a passport services facility in Charleston, South Carolina. Local management says they understand the situation, that they typically have gotten paid on time. This is an unusual thing where they are not getting paid on time, but they don't have answers as to why they aren't tapping into the money. And based on data that I've seen here, provided by the nonprofit Protect Democracy, they have some OMB data available showing that for fiscal 2026, the State Department has at least $500 million in passport fees ready to go. It's in a fund that the department should be able to tap into here. Hinton says, meanwhile, passport services are operating business as usual. He says that his office actually recently hired an employee, but so far that employee has not gotten any pay on the job.
And we heard the exasperation there in Boyd Hinton from Neffy's voice. I mean, from what you can tell so far, is that sort of representative of the way rank and file employees are feeling in passport services?
Yeah, and one thing Hinton said to me, really stood out. He says that it's gotten to a point where some of his members have actually approached management and asked if they could self-furlough, is the phrase they used. That's not really a thing as I understand it. That's obviously a decision that comes down to management and agency leadership of who has to keep working during the shutdown and who is furloughed. And that's a decision that rank and file employees don't really get to make, but their argument is that they need money coming in to pay the bills. And they've seen other employees like air traffic controllers. They are now taking second jobs with Uber and DoorDash, according to their association, working some late shifts and then doing this gig economy work just so they have some revenue coming in. And they would like to be among them doing that same type of thing.
Do we know if this money is going to pay for something else, or what else are you hearing from the State Department about, this overall issue?
So the State Department didn't answer any of my specific questions of what exactly is going on here with the money. They did say in a statement that the hardworking men and women of the State Department are showing up and delivering results for the American people. Despite the shutdown, I did hear from the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Jean Shaheen. She says, as we've been talking about here, that this is not how this usually happens in a shutdown. Passport services always gets paid on time. She has some questions as well as to what's going on here. And it's a situation where a lot of people are not getting answers, and it's a new and novel situation in the shutdown.
And passport services is not unique across the government in the sense that there's an awful lot of portions of individual agencies that are fee funded in kind of similar ways. Have we heard stories of similar things happening there where things are just different in this shutdown as far as how that money is being used or not used?
Yeah, there's a similar situation going on at the General Services Administration. A couple of weeks ago, I had reported that some employees there are furloughed, employees who work for the Federal Acquisition Service and the Public Building Service. And that was a surprise to them because in every other shutdown, they have been working and getting paid on time because they are funded through non-congressional funds. They're paid through what's called the Acquisition Services Fund and the Working Capital Fund at GSA. And so they were caught off guard to hear that they were getting furlough notices, and they have really been unable to get any answers as to why that's the situation now. Now that there were a group of Democratic lawmakers, both in the House and Senate, that did cite my reporting, and they are asking OMB for answers as to why this is happening at GSA and why this is happening at the State Department's Passport Services Office.
And hopefully we get some of those answers soon. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Thanks a lot, Jory.
Thanks, Jared.
And you can find Jory's story at federalnewsnetwork.com.